function. Welcome everyone to the July edition of the Canadian Transfusion Trials Group Research Methodology Lecture Series. So just to recap what we have covered already this year, we have discussed the formulation of your research question, the issue of what type of trial to perform to answer it, the design of your protocol, your assembly of resources, including your research team and financing for the study itself. And so now at this point, if you are ready to go in conducting your clinical trial, there's all sorts of wisdom to be gained speaking to people who have done this a few times with success. And that was why we invited Dr. Nadine Shehata to speak on this particular topic. And for those who haven't had the pleasure, Dr. Shehata is a hematologist for the Special Pregnancy Program at Mount Sinai Hospital, a division of the Medical Disorders of Pregnancy Program at the University of Toronto, and the medical director for the Transfusion Medicine Laboratory Program at Mount Sinai Hospital. She has published a number of landmark studies in transfusion medicine, including an important randomized controls trial of different transfusion thresholds for patients undergoing cardiac surgery, and therefore has some very valuable experience on the ins and outs of actually conducting a clinical trial. So Nadine, with that, I will pass over the podium to you.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Jacob, and also for the opportunity to discuss this. And so I was asked to discuss the conduct of a clinical trial and what could be done to optimize the conduct of a clinical trial. I'm going to turn off my video as I'm speaking because periodically my presentation will pause. So I just want to make sure that it's smooth, and then I'll turn it back on again at the end. Okay, so just a disclaimer, this presentation will really focus on a funded global clinical trial, meaning that you've been successful in getting your funding and now it's time to actually start. I am going to be discussing a clinical trial, but whether it's a prospective cohort or any other study design, I think there are some aspects that are really generalizable to those study designs as well. So I have two objectives overall for the next 40 minutes or so. It's to really describe aspects in detail of organizing a clinical trial, and then provide some suggestions from my limited experience for the conduct of a clinical trial. As you will see, and as we go through the presentation, I'm going to be formatting and categorizing several aspects in the conduct of a clinical trial. And so the first is I'm going to sort of categorize into phases of what actually should be done in a clinical trial. And I'm going to sort of describe the first 6 months, and then the actual clinical trial, and then closing of the study. And I think many would be aware of this in terms of the conduct of a clinical trial after you receive funding, that there are certain periods, and each period is going to take a considerable amount of time. So that first 6 months after you received your funding, in my opinion, is critical. It's critical from the perspective of it is time that needs to be spent to ensure the conduct of the trial once it starts is going to run smoothly, and that you don't need additional time to address barriers that come along. In essence, it's an opportunity to determine what barriers you could potentially experience once the trial is undergoing, and be prepared to approach those barriers. Now, there are obviously going to be barriers that you might approach that you weren't anticipating, but it's really to try to sort of put the time and effort in anticipating future barriers overall. So my next category, in that first month, I'm going to divide it into what you see at the top there being personnel, those being the coordinating center, research staff, steering committee, data safety monitoring board, the preparation phase, which is document preparation as well as data preparation. Most trials now will include electronic case report form, so it's all database preparation. And then what I think should be the final steps, which are really REB submission and clinical trial registration. So really the first is, let's focus on the personnel. So from a coordinating center, particularly for multi-center trials, that are including other global centers, central coordination is going to be essential to success of that study. And if you haven't included someone or a coordinating center as part of your grant submission, then the next step is really to get that coordinating center. And at times when coordinating centers are approached, it's assumed that certain aspects will be undertaken by that coordinating center. But I would encourage sort of the asking to ensure that everything that you think that coordinating center is going to be doing for you is actually going to be done. Such things as contracts and data sharing agreements. A coordinating center may or may not be able to do that, might leave it back to hospital contracts to actually get that done. Will they be available to determine what the best trial insurance is going to be for international studies? Trial insurance is not going to be that important for sort of national studies because we're covered, but certainly for global studies. And how will you address that? Will that coordinating center be responsible for ensuring that the investigators, as well as the research team of the investigators, are able to conduct that study, or is it going to be left to your team? And to enable the sort of the acquisition of that knowledge, that means someone is actually collecting CVs, proof of clinical practice, good clinical practice documentation that are required for a trial. It may seem intuitive that a coordinating center has someone to provide statistical support, but that may not be the case. And again, it's important to determine whether or not statistical support will be provided. A centralized database, as I mentioned in the previous slide, most most case report forms now are electronic, but would that database be able to actually permit international investigators for also inputting their data? And lastly, are there going to be personnel for data management, or are you responsible for actually hiring those personnel? So then the research staff. Ideally, you would want experienced research staff, but there are many inexperienced research staff that are very dedicated and devoted to actually getting up to pace of becoming a really good research assistant, so that whether it be someone who you think is actually experienced or inexperienced, it's ensuring that you know what you're interviewing for and the details of what you require in research personnel, and ensuring that if you don't know, then someone else knows, and that you have that person with you when you're interviewing these individuals. Regardless whether it's someone who has or appears to have a lot of experience or an individual who's inexperienced, I would suggest be prepared to supervise and ensure that you're actually with that individual routinely, so that what you think is getting done is actually getting done for that trial. And lastly, it's ensuring that research staff complete the research training required. And I think this is just a hospital requirement now for any research personnel, such as good clinical practice, research ethics training, and if it's a drug trial, Health Canada Division 5 training. A clinical trial is not an individual effort. A clinical trial, when you've submitted it, means that there are numerous investigators that are likely to have participated in your success in getting funding for a trial. But in addition to that, there are additional people that can assist with the success of the trial. And I'm going to just discuss briefly a trial steering committee and the data safety monitoring board. Just a caveat prior to the discussion of the trial steering committee, I think what we do, at least locally, from my experience in comparison to what other international sites do with regards to a trial steering committee, may be different. There are some similarities, however, such as a trial steering committee should include all members from different geographical regions. that are participating in the trial. And the bottom line is they consider the right safety and well-being of trial participants as the most important. Outside sort of, I think from a at least Ontario or national perspective, trial steering committees are generally independent, that they don't have, they're not part of the actual collaborative team that is conducting the trial. Um, with my experience of trials in, at least in Ontario and in Canada, the trial steering committees include the PIs that are responsible for that trial, but that trial oversight is still the responsibility of the trial steering committee. And a trial steering committee is there to monitor and supervise the progress of a clinical trial and to ensure that it's conducted properly, so that they should be reviewing the trial at routine basis. And it's really dependent on how fast or slow recruitment is going. And essentially, if there are decisions that need to be made, that they are available on an ad hoc basis. And lastly, they would also consider recommendations of the DSMB if a DSMB, or excuse me, a Data Safety Monitoring Board makes suggestions for change of a trial. So the next really is the Data Safety Monitoring Board. And they are essentially that. They're there to monitor safety. Individuals that belong to a data safety monitoring board are essentially those that are experienced trialists that are going to provide both clinical and methodological expertise, as well as statistical support. So, for instance, as Jacob mentioned, with regards to looking at transfusion triggers in cardiac surgery, we had an anesthetist, cardiac surgeon, someone with transfusion expertise, methodologist, a statistician, and the chair of the DSMB was someone who was very experienced in clinical trials. As part of that process in assembling the DSMB, it's also actually developing a charter. And that charter, as many other documents that I'm going to describe during this presentation, is really detailed outlines about what is to be expected by being a DSMB member and a DSMB chair. There should be some brief protocol overview, just because some members, although they may have experience in anesthesia or cardiac surgery or being a trialist, may not have the same experience in that specific area of focus for the clinical trial. It should actually give people sort of an upfront expectations of how many times do you actually want to meet. Everyone is busy. So to stipulate that upfront will ensure that people are aware of what they're required to do. The meeting structure. And so generally speaking, a DSMB will deliberate and make decisions, but in the structure of a meeting, the PIs will usually be present for most discussion. And then there's what is called a closed aspect, where the DSMB deliberates on its own if there are decisions that are to be made, because really they should be at arm's length of the PIs and the trial. Report templates are developed up front to be reviewed by the DSMB, who often can give very valuable feedback about what should be included. And that DSMB charter should describe aspects of the analysis that are critical to be reviewed by that group, such as an interim analysis or decision rules or quorums. What is going to be required for agreement when it comes to decision making. So if they have opinions about whether or not this needs to be changed, at least they know what you're thinking, and those can be revised so that everyone is on the same page when it comes to decision making. So that was the personnel aspect of the first 6 months. Now it's sort of time to prepare the documents that are going to be required, and as well as the electronic case report form for database entry. Now, the document preparation, and this is a lot on this slide, and we'll go through each one, requires really a detailed development for each aspect. Again, to ensure that if you have to give this to another site or any group, that the expectations are upfront, are transparent, and easy to follow. So of the documents that need to be prepared, at least in my opinion, the following, and there may be a lot more, need to be done. A manual of operations, which I think is standard for all. a delegation log, screening log. Everyone knows that the consent form is required, but I'll discuss this in a little bit of detail. Consider as part, even starting, what strategies you're going to consider to increase enrollment if enrollment is poor. Anticipate poor enrollment. How you're going to analyze that data in the statistical analysis plan, ensuring that there is accuracy of what has been entered in the database, so data verification plan. And as you're about to start, the site initiation visit presentation, as well as a knowledge translation plan. So I'll first start off with what I consider the crux of a clinical trial, those first five documents. So first is the manual of operations. And the manual of operations is a step-by-step, all-inclusive guide, so that if you've, for instance, submitted to CIHR or Heart and Stroke or anyone else, you've included all aspects of what you've included for that submission, plus more, sort of a step-by-step guide as to what needs to be done, such as when should data be collected? How should it be collected? What potentially are barriers to collecting that data? What is the organizational structure of the study? What are the investigator responsibility? As you can see on the right hand of the slide are the schedule events. Schedule events, in my perspective, is described in the manual of operations, written as well as visually, so that everyone who either works visually or needs to see it in writing has both options available to them. In essence, you're making it easy to make sure that the information that is required to run that trial smoothly is going to be done. I've included at the bottom of that slide, include a summary. And I think this is really important. It might seem like such a simple point, but from my perspective, there should be some sort of summary document, and most manual of operation guidelines would suggest this at the beginning. And it's anticipating that you're going to have some people who might be interested in the trial that you haven't approached, that you can just send them a summary to start gauging their interest about whether or not they want to participate. The next really is the delegation log. And the delegation log essentially is, what is the responsibility of each individual member of that research team at every single site? And you want to know who they are. You'll probably only be liaising, for instance, with one PI. There might be several PIs at the site. They might have several research staff, but it's important to determine who they are and what the responsibilities are going to be, and have it in writing so that at least when you go back, if there are aspects that haven't been covered the way you want them to, you know who to communicate with. And you also will need to know these individuals and ensure that they're able to be responsible for the conduct of a trial. So a delegation log, and I've just given you an example of one here, will list what the responsibilities are. Like, is the responsibility of the individual to identify subjects or obtain written consent, or both? Or are they responsible for randomization? And then below that is really each individual, and listing those number under those individuals to determine who's responsible for what in a clinical trial. I think every clinical trial requires a screening log, and I think the vast majority will include a screening log. And the screening log helps to prepare for what is called the consort, which is that sort of diagram that everyone sees at the beginning of each trial that's published, which is, how did you identify these patients? Who were they? Who were excluded? Who were allocated to interventions? And what was the follow-up of those patients? Essentially, it's required to determine the generalizability of the individuals that were included in your trial in comparison to other patients overall. So as you can see on the left-hand side, I've indicated what to include when it comes to screening patients, such as who was eligible, who was approached for consent, who consented, who was randomized, and who was lost to follow-up. I've given you an example of such a screening log. When one develops a screening log, it's always important to just trial run it with a couple of patients to see, and to ensure that everything that you've put on there is detailed enough that someone can follow it. So essentially it has everything that needs to be collected. It's not so much individuals that weren't approached, It's individuals who were approached and whether or not they consented and whether after consent they were actually recruited. The last aspect in that process, I think, is the consent form. And I consider the consent form as part of sort of one of the last steps because a lot that has to be included in the consent form should have been finalized, for instance, in the manual of operation or in the screening log, because the last thing that you want to do is have to go back to REB to revise that consent form over and over. It should really be clear and detailed. And I think, if you're sort of applying for a clinical trial through sorry, I just have some background announcements. Through CTO, for example, there is a structure to that consent form, and obviously you have to follow that structure, but there are aspects that you can actually include that are going to be very specific for your trial that do take time to actually develop accurately to ensure that objective information is given to patients. And I would actually suggest also getting patient input into a consent form from the perspective of, is it clear or does it appear to be biased, for instance, if it's a randomized controlled trial to one intervention versus the other. The last is similar as a schedule of events is included in a manual of operations. It's also included and actually required probably by CTO to be included as well in consent forms, but because it's showing patients what they are to expect as part of being a participant in that study. For strategies to increase enrollment, I personally am biased in ensuring that not only people are aware of the study by a manual of operations, for instance, is having something prepared for those sites to be able to present that study to their teams to ensure that everyone who's involved understands the rationale of that study. And I like to prepare seminars that are recorded and with a prepared script that can be sent off to individual sites to make it easy for everyone. It takes a lot of work, as everyone knows, to do a clinical trial. So making it easy for that site by preparing any kind of documents that they would require will facilitate recruitment and enrollment. Similarly, newsletters, and I will discuss this on a subsequent slide, I would suggest thinking about how you're going to communicate with your sites about how the study is going. And again, in any kind of trial, it's not an individual person, it's all sites that really should be encouraged and welcome to participate and congratulated upon their participation in a recruitment, and that should be included in a newsletter. Also consider upfront prior to getting asked questions throughout the trial. What do you think people would ask? And prepare those responses so that when you get email communication, you're very quick to respond with the answer that they require. And lastly, think about tips for coordinators. If you've had the opportunity of having a pilot study where you've run into problems, then you know what tips are going to be required to help recruitment. So just a couple of examples of those. So first, the newsletters. Um, Things to think about. How often do you want to send out those newsletters? Everybody is busy, but they need to also hear about the trial. So think about the frequency at which you want to send them out. Always phrase positively. There may be people that are really struggling to recruit and enroll, and just because they haven't had anyone enrolled at their site doesn't mean that they're trying. So phrasing any item when it comes to recruitment and enrollment positively will really improve, at least in my perspective, the ability of individuals to actually recruit. Give people rewards, highlight sites and investigators, make sure that people know who they are, highlight those top enrolling sites. Positive reinforcement is always really good. Similarly, if you're looking at adherence in terms of are they actually following what you want them to do, highlight those sites. Make things visual, as you've seen there, and make them also in writing, similar to sort of the manual of operations. Some people like both. Let people know what the targets are. They may know, you may have sent out the manual of operations and you have the target in the manual of operations, but not everybody is going through such a detailed document. They need to see it over and over and quickly. Include them. Highlight common frequently asked questions. If someone has asked a question at one site, someone else might be thinking about it at another site. It'll make it easier for you when you list them. And then ensure that there are links to important documents, whether you use Dropbox or if you have the funds and personnel to create a website, then do that as well. There are tips that can be used for research coordinators. There may be inexperienced research coordinators when it comes to a large clinical trial. I would suggest the following based on experience, such as, use a clinical coordinator who has experience and let that clinical coordinator develop some of the tips for additional sites, such as this is what we did, maintain a consistent presence. Sometimes people feel uncomfortable to be in front of physicians all the time, but the importance of that is actually letting them know that this is what needs to be done. Flag patient records. If there are people still using paper records, use stickers. There are electronic flags as well. Epic allows us to do this when it comes to research studies. Make sure that people are aware. Email consistently, be in front of people to ensure that people are aware of a study. Ensure that research coordinators are comfortable with checking in daily, that they're not imposing on the teams, that they are creative. And if they find that there's a new available resource that they can use that improves, that everybody else be aware of it. And lastly, really thank everyone for their involvement. This is a lot of work for everyone who's involved. So those are the documents that I think are the crux prior to actually the next steps, which are developing a statistical analysis plan. And even though the study hasn't started, and as part of a grant submission, there is a statistical analysis plan. The statistical analysis plan for a study is going to be much more detailed and will require that the data that are inputted are actually accurate. So a data verification or a statistical monitoring plan is required. And in brief, a statistical analysis plan, as I said, is a much more detailed plan about how the data are going to be analyzed. It will include a primary and secondary analysis. If you haven't considered a subgroup or sensitivity analysis, then it can be included as well. It will include such things as how you're going to approach withdrawals and missing data if you have not approached them already. And it would include the tables. So table 1 in any kind of paper is the characteristics table. Draft what you think is going to go into your characteristics table before actually getting close to the start of study, because you want to think if there are data that you hadn't considered, that they would be added to an ECRF, for instance, and how you want your outcomes table to look. So that, again, if there's anything missing from what you thought of previously, it can be addressed prior to the start of the study. The second aspect here in terms of the statistical analysis plan is ensuring that you've got accurate data. And so how to monitor to optimize accuracy of data collection varies. It is essential for all trials, obviously, to have accurate data. There are several means of doing this, such as on-site source data verification. That means someone is going to each site and checking each data point for each of those centers. Obviously, for multi-center studies and international studies, it's very expensive. Industry can easily do this with their funded trials, but not many others can. Remote source data verification, meaning you're getting on some sort of web meeting and seeing all the data for all patients. Central statistical monitoring, where our data checks. So you take all the data that are actually in the database and statistically look at them to see if there are any outliers, or a combination. And on the next slide, I'm just going to give you an example of what we did, which is a combination of both. So we did source data verification. So source data verifications mean we got all the data on one patient. We didn't do it on site. It was sent to us. We selected 3 patients randomly of the first 20. And the rationale of doing that is you want to make sure early on that a site has not randomized 100 patients before these checks are put into place. And you want to know simple things like, does the patient actually exist? So you've received the data. Are they in the ECRF? Do they meet the eligibility criteria based on what you have? Has, importantly, informed consent been provided? Is there complete data for all the visits that have taken place? And has everything that is required been inputted, and does it match the, for instance, laboratory results that you've received? And is there some sort of hospital summary form that you can take a look at to ensure that the data for outcomes has been inputted appropriately? So that's source data verification. And we didn't do it for all patients. It was just a few to ensure that a center was entering data appropriately. We also used a statistical monitoring plan because, again, we didn't have funding for source data for verification at site, and it was a large study. We used sort of statistical analysis to determine whether there were any outliers. And it's essentially that. It's a plan to look at irregularities and inaccuracies. It's done at a center level, meaning that we take each center and we compare it to the other centers. We look visually and graphically at, for instance, mean, medians, proportions to ensure that all centers are quite similar. I've shown you in that graph on the left-hand side sort of an example of outliers that you can see there. Sort of everybody's sort of centering around a hemoglobin concentration of 10 to 15, and then you've got these red dots that are very high and very low. It's something like that to determine if they're outliers, and then we would go back to the site to ensure that they've entered their data correctly. When it comes to a statistical monitoring plan, what to include with regards to data, in my opinion, would be, obviously your primary and secondary outcomes, but any other data that are easy to input inaccurately, like frequent laboratory data. So if you're collecting hemoglobins frequently, that might be a data point to actually check. You've gotten through most of your documents, and at this point, it's starting to get ready for that first visit with sites. So it's preparing a presentation to give to sites. And I've seen this done a little bit differently, where we met with each site and had a site presentations. Others just send it electronically for approval. I would also suggest in that first 6 months is developing a knowledge translation plan. What are you going to do with the information at the end? To have a plan for payments and to consider Health Canada registration if it's a drug trial. I'll just briefly discuss all of these three. So for that site initiation visit, and again, it's the presentation about how each site is going to conduct the trial. Really make it easy. It might seem easy for you, but really simplify it for a site so that they don't seem overwhelmed with all the data that you're presenting, meaning present what is going to be relevant and ensure that it's understandable. All of these sites that are participating will not know the detail that you will know. So it's important to try to ensure that the critical data that they need to know are presented in that initiation PowerPoint presentation. Everything else is going to be in the manual of operations anyway that they will get. So anything that you need to emphasize really is in that first visit. So things such as the relevance of the trial, the experience of the investigators, the interventions and the side effects. Reassure people that what they're going to be offering is going to be safe. The outcomes, what kind of follow-up and how long. Maybe include a couple frequently asked questions, and then discuss any issues up front that you may have already experienced. The presentation is essentially short, about 30 minutes. It's individual's attention span. Again, so that not to overwhelm with a lot of information. And then I would suggest including a session about how to enter data, at least to make people comfortable with electronic database, and how to access all the documents that you're going to have ready for those sites to be able to launch. That knowledge translation plan, and although it's still in the first 6 months and you've got a ways to go in completion of a clinical trial, I do think it's important to have an idea of what you're going to do at the end of the trial and actually try to engage individuals that you might want to communicate with to help you disseminate and then down the road implement changes based on what you find. And that you're thinking about things like what are the key messages and who should I actually be discussing those key messages with? Can I identify a local champion up front who will be able to actually relay those key messages? Do I want to include mass media? And if so, do I want to include them now or wait at the end? I think it's very important to liaise with guideline developers, particularly if there's a specific group that you know will be able to use your data in future guidelines to make them aware that this is now going to be coming, for instance, in the next couple of years. Just want to touch base a little bit on payments, and this is more so based on my experience. You've submitted a budget for your study. You know what you're going to do with that budget. You've discussed that you're going to give sort of upfront startup fees and then recruitment fees. How does that get done? I would suggest in the startup fees being quite careful that giving a center all of the startup fees may not equate to that center actually enrolling patients. Thus, sometimes what we do is give part of the starting fees, and then when a couple of people are enrolled, giving the remainder of the starting fees. If it's a trial that's going to involve having to actually look at a number of patients to determine eligibility with only a few of them that are going to be eligible, consider, for instance, screening fees to motivate people to have to actually go through all those charts to be able to actually screen and recruit. And then when it comes to then the final per patient fees for that individual, some of the per patient fees are paid out when the individual is enrolled, and the remainder is when all data are entered and any inaccuracies are assessed to ensure that you have adequate funding for each individual enrolled. Again, I'm just going to touch base on Health Canada approval, and it's a minor point. Obviously, a lot of people think that with drug trials that you're going to submit to Health Canada. Some people aren't aware, though, that even though for commonly used drugs, and I've used the example here of tranexamic acid, for instance, tranexamic acid is used for all patient populations, but in the drug monograph, these are the only indications for tranexamic acid. So anything else will require Health Canada approval. Okay, we've come down to sort of the end of the first 6 months, which is REB submission, clinical trial registration, and I've left those to the end because they really follow the database preparation. And the database development aspects are going to be as critical as everything else. It's an electronic database. It needs to have data points that are going to fulfill your requirements for instance, laboratory follow-up of patients or your primary and secondary outcomes. So that will take a lot of time. You want to ensure that individuals who are entering data are not going to be making mistakes. And it's very easy to make mistakes when you're sitting and putting in a lot of data points so that ranges can be developed in any electronic database. So for instance, you have a point like hemoglobin concentration, and a range can be inserted. So if someone inputs a hemoglobin concentration outside that range, it's automatically going to be flagged. And that individual will then double check to make sure that they've entered the data accurately, instead of waiting for someone to actually come back to the site to say you've entered that data incorrectly. There are ways of doing this as well for someone who's checking the database for you, because it's not you who's going to be checking. It's having things such as if someone requires an intraoperative drug, that they're actually in the OR. So if the time that drug was used is different, and it looks like it's not an intraoperative use, but a postoperative use, someone can then go back and take a look at it to say, I don't think you put in the time of that drug appropriately. Please recheck. So you've got the laboratory ranges, the range checks, and so that what you want to ensure is the queries that are sent for data accuracy are done frequently, so that when it comes to the end of the study, there aren't many data points that are going to have to be checked. If they're done at data entry, if it's done immediately after data entry, then it'll make study closure much easier and quicker. Data entry needs to be reviewed by a research group to make sure that all the checks are in place. They really should be a trial run, and the trial run can be done by the investigators as well as each site, and having it as part of the site initiation visit ensures that people are aware of errors that could occur with data entry. Lastly, there are downtimes. And so a backup plan should be put in place in case there's a downtime, particularly if an electronic case report form is being used for randomization. So the last step being research ethics board submission and trial registration. And again, so that you don't have to go back to the REB and make changes several times. It's really one submission at the end. They're going to come back with suggestions as well for changes. So the first 6 months are done. You're ready to launch. Congratulations. Just a couple of points about launching is that making sure you're preparing yourself to be accessible, responsive, and attentive to all details of that study. So the launch, you will have meetings with each center to launch them, but you also have meetings with your coordination center, as well as meetings with the research staff at the site where you're enrolling patients. Meetings with the coordination centers can occur weekly and sometimes twice a week if needed, but even upfront, frequent meetings are required. And I would suggest structuring those meetings. If it's an experienced coordination center, great. If not, at least you have in your mind what you want to discuss at each one of those meetings, such as, enrollment, contracts done, are there delays in contracts, and who can be contacted? What are the recruitment rates like? What are the consent rates going to be? Are people at our sites adherent to what you've actually suggested when it comes to interventions? Are there frequently asked questions that need to be addressed? What are the communication with sites? Are there problems with communication having certain sites being non-responsive? And if the trial has started, data entry, and to review any errors or omissions in data entry, as well as data checks on a weekly basis. There should be, in my perspective, a detailed plan for recruiting sites that you have in your mind, the number of people that are supposed to be enrolled at that site. So if they're not actually meeting that enrollment, is periodically increase the communication with that site, whether it be electronically, sometimes it's actually getting on a phone with someone to determine if they're having any issues with enrollment from the perspective of how can you facilitate or help that site to enroll patients. If there are educational seminars that need to be given, preparing them. If there are changes to the educational seminars, be prepared to change them and either provide that seminar for the team to present at their sites or be prepared for you to present it at each site as well. I've indicated as the last part in this slide, assess recruitment quarterly. That's what's actually suggested for clinical trials. We generally assess recruitment almost on a weekly basis, just to ensure, especially in a large trial, that recruitment is going to meet the targets that have been set up. In the launch of sites, you will have given the site initiation visit. It's important if all documentation has been received and you've done that site initiation visit to launch that site immediately, at least in my opinion, because it shows that you're prepared for that site to participate in that trial. Delays will result in individuals losing interest in terms of getting started. There's a lot of times a lot of excitement about getting started in a clinical trial. So the site initiation visit is done, all documents are received, and that site is launched immediately. As the trial goes on, there needs to be a focus on engagement, encouraging investigators to do other sub-studies. That's not only your study. So for instance, if you haven't included a quality of life aspect and quality of life is of an interest to another group, encourage that group to do a study on quality of life and see how it can be added on to the current study. Ensuring also that other investigators, if they have other studies, that co-enrollment is going to be an option for them so that it doesn't provide a barrier for sites to only recruit a patient for this study. It is seen as something that can easily be done if an individual can be recruited to more than one study. You've been successful, you've gone through the trial, and now it's time to close the trial. The last patient has been recruited, and as much as time and effort that has been done in actually conducting the trial, that same amount of time is going to be required in closing the trial. After the last patient is recruited, then there's that data check again to ensure that all data are entered accurately. And then the database is locked. That database lock means that there's no other data that can be entered and no changes can be made. So really ensuring that all the data is entered accurately is critical prior to that database lock. The statistical analysis, once it's done, is reviewed in detail, and this often takes days and hours to look back at the data to ensure that what you had planned in your statistical analysis plan, you're actually seeing once the analysis has been conducted. And at the end, it's really after you completed and finished the paper to be submitted, it's updating clinicaltrials.gov or any other site where you've registered your clinical trial. I have 2 slides to go, and I just want to touch on 2 points. When should the statistical analysis plan be submitted? And should the trial protocol be submitted for publication? And if so, when? And again, these are my opinions. I think the statistical analysis plan is going to be required by any publishing journal, any large journal, particularly for multi-center studies, so it should wait until the end. Similarly, the trial protocol for publication, although it's another publication, is really, from my opinion, is submitting it almost at the same time as the final publication of the paper in case there are changes to be made. Because if a protocol is actually published and changes are made after the publication, that journal will certainly be reviewing whether or not you made changes after you had finalized your protocol. And it may not be seen as something that is sort of positive from the perspective of publication. One final slide, the role of AI, and I have very limited experience in terms of the role of AI in clinical trials, but some simple things that can be done to facilitate a clinical trial by the use of AI are as follows. After things like steering committee meetings, DSMB meetings, minutes, as what we're doing now, can be taken, that might help at least or expedite the time it takes to get those minutes done. Podcasts can be developed. If PowerPoint, presentations, someone has to be sitting at a computer to hear about a study. AI can develop podcasts based on a presentation, and therefore you can actually reach more people. Summarizing concepts to make it easy can also be done via AI. Similarly, with recruitment, and I don't have much experience with recruitment, data verification, or prediction models, but there are several studies that have actually discussed this at length. From the perspective of recruitment, such things can be done. Like, for instance, if there are numerous, in an oncology center, there are ways of identifying patients that can be included in trials that can be used similarly for transfusion trials. Data verification that AI can then check as opposed to having the manual checks by an individual for data verification. And then prediction models for outputs of a clinical trial can also be incorporated in part of a clinical trial assessment. So that, as I mentioned, I don't have much experience, but I think, the future holds a lot for facilitating a lot of clinical trial conduct, making it a little bit easier, more efficient with regards to time, and hopefully better when it comes to identifying patients for clinical studies. I'm going to stop there. Just a few minutes over, just a few take-home points. Each step in the conduct of a clinical trial is important. As you know, in my opinion, the first 6 months is really critical because if done properly and all the documents that you require are done, it will enable you to focus on other aspects of the trial, such as initiation visits, enrollment, data entry. Data analysis when closing the trial is reviewed in detail as well, just to ensure there is a minimal loss of data and to ensure there are minimal errors overall. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Nadine, that was fantastic. I have to point out that I think this is the largest turnout in this lecture series that we've had to date, showing how much interest there is in the nitty-gritty of all this. I think the your point about the first 6 months being critically important, this reminds me of that famous quote by Abraham Lincoln: "If you give him 6 hours to chop down a tree, he'll spend the first four sharpening the axe." And um, uh, just before we open up the floor to the to questions here, um, I guess my for the young investigator who's starting out, who looks at all this and says, "Oh my goodness, I never got trained in any of this, maybe except for attending this lecture here." What resources, would a inexperienced PI turn to in conducting a trial? Like, is there like a book or a publication or a handbook or a manual that you use? Is it a matter of getting a good mentor? What would you recommend, to sort of learn how to do all this?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I really think it's the coordinating center, that the coordinating center has experience. I think there are several coordinating centers now have experience in giving you some sort of draft for a manual of operations, a draft for a delegation log, a draft or a screening log. Everything else, it's sort of looking at it from the perspective of what are you going to do to help others have the same knowledge as you, have the same interest as you, have the same drive as you, to input, to enroll those patients and input the data appropriately. And it's actually um, sort of becoming innovative, seeing what other people do and trying it out. And all of it was trial and error. And I have to say, I learned the most by the pilot study that I ran into when we did our pilot study. We ran into so many problems, and I had to really think about how I was going to approach those problems so that when it comes to manuals now, I think the manuals that are available are going to be essentially, as I mentioned, from the coordinating center, but you can Google everything to find out, how do you structure a trial steering committee? How do you structure a DSMB? How do you go about conducting a clinical trial? I think a lot of that, just go out there and keep looking to make sure that you sort of use whatever resources available to you to make that trial successful. Talk to people, talk to other people who have more experience than you, gauge what their suggestions are going to be and incorporate them.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
As you said, it was too nitty gritty, all the detail.
Rebecca has a question.
Hi Nadine, maybe more of a comment. Amazing talk, living it for maybe 2 decades of my life. I love how your focus was on, the startup and getting it right and revise and revisions. And I was wondering, what you thought about even the collaboration between and the communication between the PI and the investigators and the coordinating staff, and if you can comment on what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, and Rebecca, from all points. So that communication is key from the perspective of your collaborators. Make sure everyone is up to date. From a coordinating center perspective, that you're in frequent communication with them, even though you're meeting with them weekly. If there's a question from the coordination center, that it's responded to as quickly as possible. Essentially, this is the focus. Similarly, with the research staff, you might meet with the research staff once a week, but with everyone involved, maybe not so much collaborators, but at least from a coordination center and research staff, it's immediate responsiveness. Um, if you can, obviously, clinical, sort of clinical needs obviously sort of are more important and need to be done first. But from a study perspective, is once that is completed, it's really focusing on ensuring that if there are questions that are asked, then they're addressed immediately. And it's a great question, Rebecca. Communication is certainly key at every aspect of the study for all individuals who are included in the study.
Amazing. Thanks, Nadine.
Well, people gather their thoughts. I have another question, Nadine. You sort of hinted at this here, but there is a balancing act between using financial incentives to get people to actually participate and contribute their time and effort to the success of a study. And maybe inadvertently incentivizing false data collection, like fictional patients and that sort of thing. And I imagine that, that tipping point, is going to be different at every recruiting site. Do you get concerned, that, how do you find that right balance in terms of financial incentives, such that you don't have to worry about incentivizing, data falsification?
Yeah, and it's a great point, and it won't happen frequently. It's an infrequent occurrence, and most people want to ensure that the data that they have entered is accurate and there aren't any problems at all. They don't want to be the site that was the problematic site, but it
Hmm.
potentially can occur. And again, it's really looking at that data constantly to make sure that there aren't any outliers, and then addressing those outliers with individuals. I think that is the best approach. Certainly, when you identify a center and you think that center may not be entering data accurately for whatever reason, I think it's important to approach them upfront to see
Hmm.
what the issues are and try to resolve those issues. It's a very hard thing to do, to tell people, this is incorrect. I don't think this person exists. It's more so the diplomatic approach. Can you please go back, take a look at this patient, and show us the data that you have? Show me the laboratory test, the consent form, etc. That source data verification to make sure that data are accurate. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, we're just up about the end of the hour. Nadine, thank you again so much for this. I think it's really important for people to understand just the logistical effort that goes into this beyond having your brilliant idea. And yeah, I'm sure you will be getting occasional emails from people like myself in the future asking for your wisdom about how to do this and make it work. Okay, thanks again, everyone. We have one more session in the series for August, and then that will be the end of the 2024-2025 cycle. Okay.